Okay, so now that we know what Plato thought was wrong with democracy, we should probably try and figure out what he thought should go in its place, right? So, democracy is flawed for the reasons Plato says. We don't just want to throw it out and have nothing to put in its place, right? That would be chaos. What should it be replaced with? And Plato had very detailed plans about what should replace democracy. Very roughly, it's an aristocracy, which is rule by the best or rule by those who have particular skills that are necessary for ruling, right? So essentially, an aristocracy just says, hey, there's a certain character trait that's really useful for this job, and we should only give the job of leader to those who have this character trait. But there's much more to it than that, so let's get into the details. First, we should ask ourselves, why should we form the state in the first place? Right? So there's always the alternative of just staying in nature, right? So whatever state man was in before he formed a government, we could just go back to that, right? Why should we form a state in the first place? Why shouldn't we just have what the political anarchists are calling for now, just little communities living by themselves with no government oversight? Plato thinks that we need to form the state. The state is necessary. And that's because no individual is self-sufficing, right? So even though we could form communities, even those small communities aren't going to be self-sufficing, right? We can't, within a family, especially in the individual, but even within a family or a small social group, we can't possibly have all the special skills we need to provide food, shelter, clothing, crafts, art, entertainment, so on and so forth. Right? So Plato thinks the state is necessary because it's how we can group up in order to survive and divide labor among a group of people. Right? So that's really important. Our small group um, can't possibly do all of the labor that we need to have an advanced society. So we all pool together, form a government, divide labor up among the population, and we get all the things that we want. So this will also include not just food, shelter, and clothing, but like I said, things that are luxuries, right? So things that aren't necessary for survival, but things that we think are valuable and things that we want, like the arts, like luxury time, um, like entertainment, like fine jewelry, so on and so forth. And so now already we get to see the types of people Plato's going to need in his city. And one is going to be the craftsman. So he roughly divides his city into three classes, the first being the craftsmen. And the craftsmen are those who work in the shops, right? They provide us with the goods we need, the shoemakers, the jewelry makers, so on and so forth. Um, so the craftsmen play a very important role in providing the goods that we need to live a worthwhile life. But here's a problem. We can't just have the craftsmen. The craftsmen are going to need a number of resources, right? In order to craft all the things we want for luxury and survival, we're going to need a lot of resources. And once we amass these resources, other people are going to want our resources. So we have two problems. As our society grows, we're going to need to expand. So that's going to mean getting more land so that we can get more of the resources we need. Two, once we expand, once we get these resources, other people are going to want them and we need protection. So essentially what we need now is a military class, right? We need someone who can perform the art of war or the art of expansion and allow us the physical power and the force to expand our city and protect our city from outside invaders. So now we are going to have two classes. We're going to have the craftsman class and the military class. And the military class, Plato calls the guardians. So now we have the craftsmen and the guardians. And the guardians are exactly what it sounds like. They're this group of people whose sole job is to worry about protecting the city and expanding and getting the resources we need. We'll expand on that a little bit later, but that's roughly what we need now. And then finally, well, we're going to need a third class. We're going to need someone to tell us when we should be expanding. We're going to need someone to order the workings of the city, to tell us what goods need to be produced or not, to settle questions of justice that arise when conflict happens within our city. And so we're going to need rulers. Right? So that's our third class. So we have craftsmen, guardians, and rulers. Okay, so pretty standard, right? So far, nothing earth-shattering. But Plato doesn't want to just form a state with a number of classes. He wants to form a state with a number of classes that is also just. So Plato's main concern is forming a just city. A just government, a just state, however you want to say it. So Plato needs to tell us, well, when is a state or government just? That's a really important question, right? How does the state have to act? What does it have to look like? How does it have to be in order to serve justice or be the maximally just state? And so Plato thought that justice occurs when we have the proper ordering of the parts of the state. Right? So we have these three classes, we have the types of jobs they're supposed to be doing, and we need all three of those things to play their proper parts. In other words, Plato thinks that each class sort of has a natural function that they're sort of naturally built to perform. And so we need people to perform those functions that they're sort of naturally made for. And when they do that, we get a just city. But it's a little bit more than that. So what does the proper ordering of the parts look like? Well, when we have the proper ordering of the parts, the city will embody three virtues. So this is really important. Write this down. The just city will embody the virtues of temperance, courage, and wisdom. So when the city embodies those three virtues, we know the city is properly ordered and the city is just. Okay, so now the question is, how do we put people into this proper ordering, right? So we know what a proper ordering will look like. It'll embody all of these virtues, but how do we get there? Right? So he's given us sort of the end point, and we need to figure out how we can get there. So in terms of talking about our natures, Plato thinks people individually also have natural latent potentials, right? So when people are born, they're born already with this sort of natural potential, and we can divide people up based on that. And so this might sound a little hokey at first, right? We shouldn't just be basically looking at somebody's genetics and saying, okay, well, now you're a craftsman, now you're a ruler, so on and so forth. But there does seem to be some intuitive reason to agree with Plato here. Right, so think about two people in our society. Right, so you have two people who have the same sort of genetic makeup, right? Their bodies are built the same. Let's say that. So they have the same type of musculature. They have the same quality muscle joints, so on and so forth. Their reflexes are similar. But now think, okay, we have these two people who have a very similar body, but some of them might have a natural latent ability for football, right, while another may not. Right? Even though they have the same type of body and genetic potential, they have this natural ability, right? So one of them will, number one, be able to understand the workings of the rules for football, right? They might be able to have this sort of foresight that they need in order to run proper routes or shake a defensive player, so on and so forth. And so that person goes, tries out, and football works out great for them, right? But this other person comes along and he's like, hey, that guy has the same body I do. Let's see if I can do this. And so he tries out, but he's missing all of those things, right? Maybe his foresight is off. He just can't really get a grip on how the playbook works, so on and so forth, right? So you can have two people who have very similar bodies who just happen to have different natural potentials. And so, I mean, think about this in another sense. If you don't like sports analogies, you can have two people who have very similar intelligence levels, right? So two people, similar intelligence levels, but one just has a natural inclination to use that intelligence and study mathematics. Another one has this high level of intelligence, but is only really worried about literature. Right? And so, even though they have this similar intelligence, they each have this latent natural ability for different subject matter. Right? And so, even though they're equal, well, you might worry about whether they're equally intelligent, but if they have similar intelligences and one carries them to math, one carries them to literature, right? They have these natural abilities that are drawing them one way or the other, possibly. So what Plato's saying isn't really as crazy and limiting to our freedom as it initially sounds, right? He might be onto something. We might actually have natural latent abilities. So Plato runs with this, right? He says, well, people really do have these natural latent abilities, and we should divide them up as we see fit, right? Not as we see fit, as those natural abilities see fit. Right? So some people are just simply meant to be craftsmen. They have a natural latent ability for shoemaking, watchmaking, cloth making, so on and so forth, right? They just have this natural ability that kicks in, and they're good at these things, and we should put them into those positions. And importantly, we'll see that these people just don't have a natural ability for leadership or for deep intellectual thinking. Some people, so they aren't fit to be rulers. Some other people will have natural abilities. They'll be naturally courageous. They'll be naturally very physically gifted. They might naturally understand the art of war. Right? These are the types of people Plato wants to put into the guardian class. Right? So if you have a natural ability for watchmaking, we don't want to send you to war. Right? That just doesn't make sense. Right? If you don't have an understanding for war, you do have an understanding for watchmaking, you should go be a watchmaker. And the people who are courageous and understand war tactics and are physically gifted, like we want them protecting us, right? So it's just dividing up people to see who's the most fit for each position. And like I said, this seems to have some basis, right? People do tend to have natural abilities. And so finally, he thinks that the natural ability, because we've described the craftsman and the guardian, now we need to get to the rulers, right? So what is their sort of natural potential? Well, he says it's this potential for intellectual endeavors and the gaining of knowledge about reality. And so what he means here is essentially a philosopher. That's why you get the joke in the Twitter post above me. But really what he's looking for here is someone who can come to a full understanding of the reality of justice, the reality of goodness, the reality of morality and virtue. Because he thinks if you have a natural potential for intellectual endeavors and gaining knowledge of reality, you'll gain knowledge of the forms through enough time, right? And then once you have perfect knowledge of the forms, you'll know exactly what to do when it comes to structuring the city. You'll know exactly what needs to be done to make sure the city remains just. Okay, and we'll continue in the next video.